Nvidia as a company has definitely come a long way in the last decade, bringing multiple things to the table such as multiple generations of graphics cards, increased performance along with impressive power efficiency improvements, and revolutionary technologies such as GPU boost, dynamic super resolution, multi-frame anti-aliasing, and most recently RTX ray tracing, just to name a few. So now that a new decade has begun, and not really in a good way, I thought I'd take a trip back to the beginning of the last decade with this. This is the Nvidia GTX 460, a graphics card that was once considered as Nvidia's mid-range powerhouse. Released back in July of 2010 with 1GB of onboard video memory, this was definitely one of the best bang for the buck options that was on the market at the time. Just how well can a GTX 460 perform in games in 2020? Well, let's find out together, shall we? Arcade Rewind is an Australian-based company that is driven to bring the arcade experience directly into your own living rooms. No, don't you dare! Check out the link in the video description for more info. Okay, as you can see, everything is up and running, ready to go and looking pretty. However, as we look over to the screen, there is absolutely no display whatsoever. That's because I overlooked one important issue. This GTX 460 only supports connections in forms of DVI-D, DVI-I and HDMI mini. You bad card, you very bad card. So now what you're seeing on the screen is going to result in me making an emergency trip to my local computer shop to pick up an HDMI mini cable.
2 hours later.
So yeah, in case you're wondering, I did have to haphazardly set things up out here, and the reason for that is because of the DVI cable. So as you can tell looking at this piece of footage, my daily monitor, the Acer Predator X34, it doesn't have a DVI connector on it, whereas this Agon monitor right here does. And it was honestly a lot more simpler just to bring the computer, monitor, wireless keyboard and mouse, place them on this benchtop instead of having to deal with moving two huge monitors around in a small room and having to deal with all them messy cables I have going on behind my desk, which can make plugging things into the monitor and computer a little bit tedious and confusing. But anyway, computer's up and running, drivers are fully installed, and on that note, let's move on to the first game. Just a quick disclaimer before we continue, all the gameplay footage that you're about to see will look like it's producing massive amounts of stuttering. However, I can safely verify that the stuttering that you may see in this video is not a final representation on the actual gameplay. So first up, I wanted to start with something a little bit light and then work my way up to the more demanding games. And the first game that I chose to try out is the ever popular Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, released around the same time as the GTX 460. And at 1080p at maximum settings, we got an average frame rate of 95 frames a second, with a minimum of 31, however the 1% and 0.1% lows being 41 FPS and 1 FPS respectively indicate that there was quite a little bit of stutter. However, the stutter only occurred once, and the rest of the time the gameplay was very smooth and very enjoyable. Now obviously this was expected since that the graphics card and the game came out roughly around the same time. I only chose to use this as a benchmark to see how a well optimized AAA game worked with a mid-range graphics card like the 460 back in the day. And going by the numbers, it really looked very promising. Next on the list is Halo Reach. It released on PC earlier this year, however it's been on the gaming scene ever since September 2010. And even though the minimum system requirements for the PC version in terms of graphics cards is either an AMD HD 6850 or an Nvidia GTX 450, the GTX 460 was really struggling surprisingly. I honestly thought it would have made light work of this game, especially with the enhanced graphical settings enabled. However, when I changed the graphics settings down from enhanced to original, gameplay did improve. Not by a massive margin, but there was an improvement. We got an average frame rate of 47 FPS, with a minimum of 34 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 31 and 5. So yeah, stuttering was still occurring, however it wasn't anywhere near as bad as it was with the enhanced graphics settings enabled. But this is where things really get interesting. When I switched to Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary, I was able to play that with the enhanced settings enabled, and I got an average frame rate of 60 FPS, with a minimum of 40 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 38 and 32, indicating a very smooth gaming experience. I think it's due to the area that I was in, because in Halo Reach, I was in an outdoor environment where there's a whole bunch of graphical effects like grass, trees, the waterfall, rain, the clouds, all that stuff, having to be rendered at the same time. Whereas in Halo Anniversary, I was only in an enclosed area where there wasn't a whole lot graphical wise going on. And that to me explains why there's a huge difference in frame rates between Halo Reach and Halo Anniversary, especially when those two games have the exact same minimum requirements in terms of graphics cards. Switching gears here and increasing the graphic demand, Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. And this one honestly surprised me more than any of the games that I tested today. At 1080p once again, with its default graphics settings of medium and high, returned an average frame rate of 53 FPS, with a minimum of 32 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 35 and 28. This is something that I would consider to be a console crusher. While the visuals might match the likes of a PS4 and Xbox One, those consoles are running this game at a maximum of 30 frames a second, whereas this 10-year-old graphics card is pushing a near 25 frames per second increase. Really impressive if you ask me, especially for the price that this GTX 460 goes for right now on eBay. More on that later. Now we've got Resident Evil 7, and oh boy, this is where things start to take a little bit of a dark turn. At 1080p at the lowest settings, an average frame rate of 26. A minimum of 21 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 21 and 19. While the 1% and 0.1% lows look pretty good, don't let it distract you from the fact that the average frame rate being below 30 FPS, definitely the definition of unplayable. Although, if we lower the resolution to 720p, we can actually now play this game at very high settings and medium shadows, and that returned a much better average frame rate of 39 FPS, with a minimum of 32 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 31 and 24. So it looks like there's still some hope for the GTX 460 after all. That is if you don't mind turning the resolution down to 720p and dealing with the noticeable blurry image, or if for whatever reason you're still using a 720p monitor in 2020. But either way, it honestly doesn't take the horrifying and creepiness nature away from this game. Next up, from the Resident Evil series, once again, the remake of Resident Evil 2. And just like in Resident Evil 7, at 1080p at the lowest settings, it was definitely not happening. An average frame rate of once again 26, with a minimum of 15 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 16 and 9. So once again, resolution dropped to 720p, but we had to keep the settings at their absolute lowest. And that returned an average frame rate of 40 FPS, with a minimum of 23 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 25 and 16. So there was some dips below 30 FPS, however, there wasn't a whole lot of them. The final summary that I gave for Resident Evil 7 translates over here as well. The game is still horrifying and still creepy. Second last AAA game I'm testing on this GPU, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now even though you can clearly see what's happening on the screen, just because we're getting somewhat playable frame rates doesn't mean that this game is considered playable. I mean, just look at all those graphical glitches. Yikes! However, 720p and the lowest settings return an average frame rate of 35 FPS, with a minimum of 3 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 5 and 1 FPS. The reason for those numbers being so low is because of the scenes changing in the benchmark test. I'm gonna say that it's definitely eating up all of the 1GB of video memory on this graphics card, and hence all of the textures are just freaking out. The final AAA game tested on the 460, Call of Duty World War II. And once again, 1080p was definitely not happening. Being stuck on the main menu at 5 FPS and trying to move the mouse cursor around to change the graphical settings was definitely not a fun experience. However, when I finally got everything down to 720p at the lowest settings, Holy crap! The performance was night and day all of a sudden, getting an average frame rate of 65 FPS, with a minimum of 31 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 32 and 29. Now while that made the game go from being definitely unplayable to all of a sudden more than playable, in terms of the graphics, I can honestly say I've seen better on a console. However, if that's a sacrifice that you're willing to make, especially for how cheap these graphics cards are going on eBay right now, honestly, go for it. And even so, performance and gameplay is still more than playable, and the story will still make you feel immersed into it, regardless of what it looks like. So going by my testing, it looks like that the GTX 460 has kind of met its end in terms of 1080p gaming, even at the lowest settings. However, at 720p, it's still surprisingly held up pretty well, especially when pretty much all games now use more than 1GB of video memory. Now I know 720p isn't really for everyone, especially in 2020. However, with the GTX 460 selling on eBay for as little as $15 US, which is roughly 24 Australian dollars, it's honestly very hard to ignore, especially when you can still buy graphics cards that are brand new and cost more than the 460 right now and perform much worse than the 460. But all that falls into the AAA gaming category. What about esports titles like Counter-Strike Global Offensive and Rocket League? What if I told you that the GTX 460 can still play those games at 1080p maximum settings above 60 frames a second? You probably wouldn't believe me if I just told you. So here's the proof. First up, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a very popular esports shooter game. At 1080p maximum settings, it granted us an average frame rate of 79 frames a second, a minimum of 56 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 52 and 6. The big difference with the 1% and 0.1% lows is due to respawning every time you die. But the rest of the time, gameplay is super smooth and super playable. For a fast-paced shooter game like CSGO, you always want to have more than 60 frames a second to have the edge, and the GTX 460 has no problem maintaining that. If you lower those settings down to medium or even low, expect that frame rate to go even further higher. And finally, Rocket League, another very popular esports title. And once again, 1080p at maximum settings, we got an average frame rate of 72 FPS, a minimum of 52 and 1% and 0.1% lows of 25 and 22, indicating practically no stutter. So if you want to build a computer based around Rocket League or Counter-Strike Global Offensive, the GTX 460 will have your back. Now, would I actually recommend anyone go out and buy a GTX 460? In my personal opinion, no, unless you are on a very tight budget. The reason why I say no is because there are graphics cards these days that easily outperform the GTX 460. You can get entry-level graphics cards like the GTX 1650 or 1660 and they'll completely outshine the 460 in every single way. Those games that were forced to run at 720p will have no problem running at 1080p with maximum settings on either of those cards. However, if you are on a really tight budget and can't spend any more than a certain amount, it's pretty hard to ignore the $15 US price tag that the 460 is currently selling for, unless you manage to find something a little more powerful. I was able to find a GTX 580 selling on eBay for around $35. $20 more than the 460, but the performance is night and day compared to the 460. However, it requires a much beefier computer to run properly. But whatever method that you choose to purchase a graphics card on the cheap side, just remember, buying something that's old but powerful is always going to be better than buying something that's new but weak. Well, thanks for watching guys. Like the video if you liked it, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already for more future content headed your way, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next one. Why is this thing lagging so badly? I'm just teleporting all over the place. Oh my